Bathwater was rarely changed. You bathed in everyone else's filth. Imagine stepping into a bath, expecting relaxation, only to realize you're sharing the water with the sweat, grime, and infections of dozens of strangers. This was the grim reality for many throughout history. Public bathhouses, once symbols of luxury, cleanliness, and community, were often bubbling cauldrons of disease where the water wasn't changed for each bather. Instead, it grew cloudier with every body that entered, thickening with human residue, oils, and whatever ailments the previous bather carried in with them. In ancient Rome, thermae, lavish public baths, were central to daily life. Emperors funded them, poets praised them, and citizens flocked to them. The baths of Caracalla could hold over 1,600 people at once, and while there were hot, warm, and cold pools, none were individually drawn. Water wasn't drained and refilled, it was reused. The wealthier patrons might start their day early when the water was relatively clean, but by midday it was filled with the sweat and dirt of hundreds. And yet, Roman bathers believed it was purifying. They didn't know they were soaking in a microbial stew. During the Middle Ages, public bathhouses persisted, especially in parts of Europe influenced by Roman tradition or Islamic hygiene practices. Bathing wasn't daily, but it wasn't entirely neglected either. Bathhouses were common in cities like Paris and London. They were social hubs, offering food, drink, and even sex, especially after the sun went down. The water rarely changed. Some tubs were filled in the morning and used until night. Others weren't emptied for days. By the end of a cycle, the water was tepid, scummy, and dangerous. The idea of germ theory wouldn't take hold for centuries. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, people didn't understand microscopic pathogens. Illness was attributed to miasmas, bad air, or an imbalance of bodily humors. Filthy water wasn't seen as dangerous, just unpleasant. Even royalty wasn't immune to this misunderstanding. King Louis XIV of France reportedly bathed only a few times in his life, and even then, likely in reused water. Instead of bathing, people masked odors with perfume or powdered wigs, while their bodies collected layers of unwashed filth. But not everyone had the luxury of avoiding the bathhouse. The poor relied on them for basic cleanliness. And therein lay the tragedy. In cramped, unventilated bathhouses, diseases like tuberculosis, syphilis, and skin infections spread easily. A single infected sore could leak bacteria into the water, shared with every bather afterward. Parasites, fungal infections, lice, all passed freely from one person to another under the false promise of purification. In Japan, the tradition of communal bathing, sento, dates back to at least the 6th century. Though the Japanese were often more hygienic than their European counterparts, early public baths still reused water for multiple bathers. Over time, Japan developed the custom of washing thoroughly before entering the shared bath, minimizing contamination. But in earlier eras, especially in overcrowded urban centers, even these baths could become breeding grounds for disease when hygiene rules were lax. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution brought a massive influx of people into cities, and with it, overcrowded slums with poor sanitation. Bathhouses re-emerged as a public health solution. Municipal authorities built them to offer working-class citizens a place to bathe. But the infrastructure often couldn't keep up. Water was heated once a day, and the same tub could see dozens of bodies. In some cases, families bathed together or took turns in the same water. The youngest child might go last, into a tub already murky with dead skin, hair, and bacteria. The phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," isn't just a quaint idiom. It hints at real historical practice. With families reusing the same water, it wasn't unthinkable that a tiny child submerged in the dark used bath could be overlooked in the murk. Whether literal or metaphorical, the phrase reflects how routine this practice was, and how unsanitary. Only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries did modern plumbing and private baths begin to take over. Soap became affordable. Indoor bathrooms became common. Germ theory revolutionized hygiene, and suddenly, bathing in used water felt not just gross, but dangerous. The bathhouses that once represented public wellness became obsolete, replaced by showers and private tubs where water flowed fresh with every use. But even today, traces of this history linger. Hot tubs and some spa treatments still rely on communal water, though filtration and chemicals like chlorine now offer protection. Still, the idea of stepping into reused water, once ordinary, is now met with disgust, a visceral reaction born of centuries of hard-earned knowledge. To us, a clean bath means crisp, fresh water, pristine and untouched. But for much of human history, a bath was a gamble. It was a place to connect, to cleanse, to socialize, and to risk infection all at once. Behind the steamy allure of public bathing lies a history as murky as the water itself. And for many who stepped into those tubs, what they left with wasn't just a sense of relaxation, but someone else's disease. Syphilis spread like wildfire in late medieval bathhouses. Imagine walking through the winding streets of a late 15th century European city. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, perfume, sewage, and smoke. The cobbled alleys lead you to the heart of the town, a grand public bathhouse, one of many that dot the urban landscape. These weren't just places to clean one's body. They were the epicenters of social life, of gossip, of transactions, both financial and carnal. And soon they would become the breeding grounds of one of the most feared diseases in human history. The rise of syphilis in the late Middle Ages was not a quiet, creeping affair. It was an explosion. Virtually unknown before the late 1400s, it suddenly tore through Europe like a plague, disfiguring faces, eroding flesh, and driving its victims to madness. And at the center of its initial spread, the bathhouses. By the end of the 15th century, Europe's bath culture had reached its peak. Inspired by Roman traditions, many cities had entire networks of communal baths. These were places where men and women, often segregated by time of day, but sometimes not at all, would strip down, bathe, relax, and more often than authorities like to admit, engage in sexual activity. Many bathhouses doubled as brothels, and even the ones that didn't often turned a blind eye to what went on in their steamy corners. They were the perfect storm of closeness, moisture, and bodily exposure, and they would pay a price for that intimacy. The first major outbreak of syphilis was recorded in 1495 during the French invasion of Naples. Soldiers returning home, French, Spanish, German, Italian, carried the disease with them, scattering it across the continent. But it wasn't just war that spread the illness, it was lifestyle. The bustling bathhouses, filled with transient patrons and little regulation, became ideal vessels for syphilis to flourish. Syphilis was devastating. Unlike the more discreet sexually transmitted diseases of the time, syphilis was grotesquely visible. It began with sores, often painless but highly infectious. If untreated, it progressed to rashes, fever, and eventually to horrifying symptoms: ulcerated flesh, collapsed noses, blindness, dementia. It struck the poor and the rich alike. No one was safe. And yet many refused to believe that their beloved bathhouses were at fault. After all, these were places of healing, relaxation, even moral virtue, at least on the surface. The cultural resistance to blaming bathhouses was strong. For centuries they had been seen as centers of hygiene in a dirty world. But the truth was hard to ignore. Physicians began to observe patterns. Those who frequented the baths seemed disproportionately afflicted. In some cities, moral panic took hold. Clergy and civic leaders denounced the bathhouses, not just for spreading disease, but for encouraging sin. Brothel baths were shut down, regulations were imposed. But it was too late. Syphilis was no longer a localized outbreak, it was a pandemic. Its reach extended far beyond the bathhouses, infiltrating marriages, monasteries, royal courts. Treatments were brutal and largely ineffective. Mercury became the go-to remedy, with patients enduring months of salivation, tremors, and eventual poisoning. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, the saying went, a grim joke for a grim disease. The irony was bitter. Bathhouses, once hailed as sanctuaries of cleanliness and health, had become vectors of suffering. Their warm waters, once a comfort, were now associated with decay and contagion. By the early 16th century, the public bathhouse culture that had flourished for centuries began to wither. Some survived in reduced form, but the golden age was over. People grew wary of communal spaces. Privacy became health, intimacy a risk. The roots of this disaster go even deeper. Many historians believe syphilis's sudden appearance and rapid spread could be linked to the Columbian Exchange, the massive movement of goods, people, and pathogens between Europe and the Americas following Columbus's voyages. Some scholars argue that the bacterium responsible for syphilis mutated from a related tropical disease brought back from the New World. Whether it was imported or homegrown, Europe was not prepared. As the disease progressed, it became a subject of dread in art, literature, and song. Ballads spoke of cursed lovers. Plays featured madmen raving from the agony of their illness. Woodcuts depicted the ravages of the disease with grotesque exaggeration, swollen faces, twisted limbs, and the haunted eyes of the dying. The public began to associate certain physical traits, sunken cheeks, pale skin, missing noses, with moral failure and syphilitic corruption. Doctors, lacking understanding of bacteria or contagion, could offer little more than guesses. Some blamed bad air or imbalances in bodily humors. Others saw the disease as divine punishment. The result was a collapse in confidence, not just in bathhouses, but in public medicine. In many cities, bathhouses were abandoned entirely, left to rot as empty shells of their former grandeur. And yet, behind all of this, lay something more human: denial. People didn't want to believe that something so pleasurable, so comforting as a warm communal bath could be dangerous. So they clung to habit, to culture, to illusion, until it was too late. By the time the bathhouses closed, the disease had already gone everywhere. History in this way repeats itself. We often ignore the early warnings. We look away from uncomfortable truths. And we convince ourselves that tradition is safety. But diseases don't care about comfort or culture or memory. They thrive in the spaces where truth is buried beneath steam and silence. Lice, fleas, and mites thrived in the wooden bath benches and towels. In the candlelit shadows of medieval and Renaissance Europe, public bathhouses were centers of social life, bodily hygiene, and, unfortunately, infestation. They offered a place where nobles and peasants alike could momentarily escape the grime of the streets. But behind the relaxing steam and perfumed waters lurked a darker reality, one crawling with life far too small to see. Lice, fleas, and mites thrived in the crevices of wooden bath benches, nestled deep within the fibers of shared towels, and burrowed into the very fabrics that were meant to cleanse. Bathers came seeking cleanliness, but often left with passengers they would never have willingly invited. The architecture of the bathhouse itself contributed to this hidden danger. Most were constructed with untreated wooden planks, which warped and cracked over time. Each crevice provided perfect shelter for lice eggs and flea larvae. The benches were seldom scrubbed, let alone disinfected, allowing successive waves of bathers to sit directly on embedded colonies of insects. Moisture lingered in the air and clung to every surface. Combined with the constant warmth of steaming water, this created an ideal ecosystem, not for people, but for parasites. Bathing towels, typically made from rough wool or linen, absorbed not just water but also sweat, dead skin, and microscopic blood traces. Rarely laundered thoroughly, if at all, these towels were often reused across dozens of visitors each day. Bath attendants might shake them out or dry them over embers, but such gestures only gave the illusion of sanitation. In truth, the towels were ticking biological time bombs, teeming with mites too small for the eye to catch, but relentless in their hunger. Once wrapped around a clean body, these fibers became the bridges that allowed parasites to leap from cloth to skin. These weren't small infestations either. Reports from the period describe outbreaks of what they called itching plague and biting fevers, referring to rashes, skin inflammation, and severe allergic reactions caused by parasite bites. Mites like Sarcoptes scabii, the causative agent of scabies, burrowed under the skin and laid eggs, spreading misery that might take months to fully treat. Lice, especially Pediculus humanus corporis, clung to seams of clothing and bathrobes and spread rapidly among the crowds, packed into steam rooms and massage chambers. Fleas embedded themselves in towels, blankets, and robes, jumping from host to host with perfect ease. Medical understanding of parasites in the medieval period was limited. Infestation was often attributed to bad humors, curses, or poor morality. The link between the bathhouse environment and the explosion of parasitic skin conditions was only dimly understood. Physicians prescribed herbal balms, sulfurous ointments, or vinegar rubs, but these treatments only masked the symptoms. In reality, as soon as the sufferer returned to the bathhouse, the cycle of infestation began anew. There is a tragic irony in the fact that the very act of seeking cleanliness often brought more suffering. Families would gather at the bathhouse once a week, sometimes more frequently, to celebrate holy days or special events. Children sat beside elders on damp wooden benches, unknowingly pressed against surfaces riddled with crawling life. Young lovers met in private steam rooms for secret trysts, unaware that they'd carry home more than just whispered promises. Even the wealthiest patrons, who paid for scented oils and private rooms, were not immune. No amount of rosewater could drown the lice hiding in the seams of their robes. The situation became so dire in some regions that authorities issued edicts attempting to regulate hygiene standards. Some bathhouses were required to change water more often, limit the number of visitors, or replace wooden furniture with stone slabs. However, compliance was rare and enforcement nearly impossible. Bathhouse owners prioritized profits, and cleanliness, real cleanliness, was an afterthought. In cities like Paris, Nuremberg, and London, inspection records sometimes mention vermin infestation among the many reasons bathhouses were shut down. Parasites not only spread discomfort, but also disease. Fleas, especially those from rats that also frequented bathhouses, carried the bubonic plague. Lice were vectors for trench fever and typhus. Though medieval people didn't fully understand disease transmission, they often noticed patterns, whole communities growing sick after using the same baths. Some began to avoid bathhouses altogether, fearing the unseen. But for many, they remained a necessity, the only place for warmth, cleanliness, and social life. With the Protestant Reformation and the changing cultural views on nudity, many bathhouses began to close. Public bathing became associated with sin, lust, and unclean thoughts. Ironically, this moral crackdown coincided with a minor drop in certain infestations, but not because people were cleaner, only because they bathed less. And yet, the legacy of the bathhouse infestation lived on in medical texts, diaries, and even medieval artwork, which often subtly depicted scratching figures or itching monks, visual codes for the plagues of skin and sanity suffered silently by so many. Today, it's tempting to romanticize the medieval bathhouse as a place of candlelight, rosewater, and sensual mystery. But that dreamy image fades under historical scrutiny. Beneath the warm water and soothing oils, there was often a relentless itch. Every bench, every towel, every robe was a potential host for a swarm of living, biting, burrowing passengers. In seeking to cleanse their bodies, many left with invisible scars, a reminder that hygiene without sanitation is no hygiene at all. We now understand that moisture, warmth, and organic surfaces are perfect conditions for parasites to flourish. But for the people of the past, these infestations were inescapable realities. They lived in a world where every effort to be clean could backfire horrifically, where the simple act of drying off could spark weeks of agony. The public bath was a gamble, not just with modesty or money, but with health, and for many, the cost of that gamble was blood, sweat, and a swarm of itching, crawling things. Bathhouses were often used for secret affairs and political plots. In the haze of rising steam and echoes of dripping water, history unfolded in ways most textbooks never reveal. The bathhouse, long viewed as a symbol of purity, luxury, or rest, was, in many parts of the world, a hidden theater of seduction, betrayal, and blood. From the marble-laced thermae of ancient Rome to the shadowy hammams of the Ottoman Empire, bathhouses were not just places to cleanse the body, they were stages where power whispered, alliances shifted, and secrets burned hotter than the water. In Roman society, the public bath was an institution. Entire cities were mapped around them, and emperors spared no expense building grand structures lined with mosaics and statues. But within these vast echoing chambers, clothed in steam and stripped of garments, people became equal, at least on the surface. That equality made the bathhouse a perfect setting for hidden dealings. Senators could sit beside their rivals. Generals stripped of armor became vulnerable, psychologically and physically. Here, gossip wasn't idle, it was strategy. It's said that Emperor Hadrian himself passed key military intelligence in the baths, trusting no parchment, only heat-dampened whispers. But Rome wasn't unique. The Japanese sento, the Korean jjimjilbang, the Russian banya, every culture had its iteration, and in nearly all of them, the bathhouse held a dual role, one of healing and one of hiding. In the Ottoman Empire, the hammam was a place where women of the court could conspire away from the watchful eyes of men. Eunuchs carried messages through the mist. Royal wives and concubines exchanged information in whispers behind veils of steam. There are documented cases where plots to poison rivals, to overthrow brothers, even to manipulate sultans began not in palaces, but in the dense humidity of marble bathing halls. In 16th century Europe, the bathhouse had fallen out of fashion in many places due to fears of disease and moral decay. But in cities like Paris, some bathhouses transformed into masked dens of political mischief. Nobles would meet in secret, disguised not by costume but by anonymity. No one looked too closely in the dim heat. The absence of clothing made everyone indistinct. There are reports, scattered and half erased, of bathhouse owners being interrogated for having hosted plots against the crown. One physician wrote in his journals that he overheard the planning of an assassination while pretending to sleep on the heated stones. And then there is murder, not metaphorical. Real blades, real blood. In Rome, a prominent patrician was said to have drowned in a cold plunge after a particularly tense political disagreement. His death ruled an accident. In Istanbul, a servant of the Grand Vizier was found dead in the furnace chamber of a hammam, his tongue cut out, his wrists bound. Rumors flew that he had overheard something he shouldn't have. Whispers exchanged in the hot stone alcove where women spoke freely, believing themselves alone. Why the bathhouse? Why did this place, designed for rest, so often become a crucible of chaos? Because vulnerability makes power malleable. When the external symbols are stripped away, clothes, jewelry, weapons, what remains is pure humanity. And in that state, true motives emerge. When no one is armed, the most dangerous weapon becomes information. And the bathhouse was an arena where information could change hands as invisibly as steam passing through the air. In medieval and early modern Russia, the banya wasn't just a space of ritualistic cleanliness, it was a threshold between worlds. Steam was believed to open the soul, and in that vulnerability, people confessed. It became custom for spies to frequent these places, not to gather intelligence, but to observe, to listen, to sense emotional cracks in their targets. In certain Moscow districts, the bathhouse was more feared than a courtroom. Words spoken in sweat were binding, and sometimes deadly. Even in modern times, during the Cold War, steam rooms in Eastern Europe and parts of the Middle East were frequented by diplomats who understood that no microphone could survive such humidity. Saunas became negotiation grounds. More than once, intelligence operatives conducted unofficial interrogations between buckets of cold water and sweltering stones. These weren't places of recreation. They were chambers of unfiltered honesty, where trust could be tested in the language of heat, exhaustion, and silence. There's something primal about the bathhouse that made it the ideal backdrop for confessions and conspiracies. Eyes softened by heat, lungs laboring through thick steam, bodies stripped of title, what remained was the raw, exposed ego. It's here that truth surfaced more easily. When one man was nothing more than skin to another, rank meant less. Yet danger somehow grew. We now install security systems, track data, hide in encrypted networks. But before the digital age, information had only one secure channel, face-to-face, and steam between. From ancient kingdoms to modern power centers, the bathhouse remained the only place where strategy could be whispered with plausible deniability. No papers, no recordings, just breath, sweat, and oath. We romanticize the past. We imagine these spaces as serene, but history was never quiet. The murmur of plots has always been louder than water when listened to closely. And so the bathhouse endures in memory, not just as a sanctuary, but as a sanctum of secrets where bodies glistened and destinies were rewritten in silence. Because when the door closed and the towels dropped, politics didn't stop. They merely went underground with the steam. Boiled water wasn't the norm. Baths were often just lukewarm disease pools. In the shadowed glow of flickering candlelight and the low murmur of voices echoing against damp stone walls, public bathhouses once stood as the communal heart of towns and cities across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. They were places of cleansing, of relaxation, of gossip and politics. But they were also unwitting breeding grounds for disease. In an age long before germ theory, when the very concept of hygiene was defined more by ritual than science, the bathhouse was a paradox, a temple to cleanliness built on the foundation of filth. To understand the danger lurking beneath the surface of those once luxurious baths, we must first grasp a vital reality of pre-modern life. Heating water was neither simple nor cheap. In medieval and early modern times, firewood was a precious resource. It required labor to gather, space to store, and time to burn. The furnaces used to warm large quantities of bathwater had to be tended constantly, often by underpaid or enslaved workers, and even then, the volume of water needed to fill communal tubs made true heating virtually impossible for most. As a result, most bathhouses settled for water that was lukewarm at best. This tepid warmth, while comfortable enough to sit in for a while, was far from sufficient to kill bacteria or parasites. Unlike the boiling water we associate with sterilization today, the water in medieval baths hovered in a range that actively encouraged microbial life to thrive. The bath, in effect, became a soup of human skin cells, sweat, dirt, oils, and a cocktail of invisible pathogens. People often bathed communally, sometimes nude, sometimes partially clothed, and often for long periods of time. They believed the warm water would open their pores, allowing toxins to escape the body. But without a proper understanding of sanitation, this belief proved not only incorrect, it was deadly. Open pores meant vulnerable skin, and in that vulnerable state, a person could easily absorb whatever the water carried. Typhus, dysentery, and fungal infections were just the beginning. Lice, fleas, and mites also thrived in these spaces, infesting the wooden benches, woven towels, and even the bath water itself. The longer someone remained in the bath, the more their skin softened, and the more susceptible they became to microscopic abrasions, tiny wounds through which infections could enter. In some regions, the combination of poor water sanitation and prolonged skin exposure led to outbreaks of boils, sores, and skin-rotting diseases mistaken for curses or divine punishment. Yet, bathhouses were not shunned. Quite the opposite, they were popular, respected, and even considered holy in some cultures. In Islamic societies, hammams were built near mosques and seen as part of religious cleanliness. In Japan, communal bathing in sento or onsen was part of social tradition and spiritual ritual. In Christian Europe, public baths were places where the rich and poor alike could come together, socialize, and even arrange business or political alliances. This cultural reverence masked the darker truth. The illusion of cleanliness often concealed a microbial minefield. Heating water to a true boil, enough to kill pathogens, would have meant an enormous increase in labor, cost, and time. It was a luxury reserved only for the very wealthy, and even they rarely bathed as often as one might imagine. For the common people, the reality was far more grim. Lukewarm water reused across many bathers in a single day, never truly cleaned, only topped up or lightly skimmed. Filth accumulated silently, mixing into the very water meant to cleanse. Compounding the problem, many bathhouses began doubling as brothels during the late medieval period, particularly across Europe. Sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, whose terrifying spread shocked the continent in the 1490s, found a perfect vector in the bathhouse's warm, shared waters. The synergy between unsanitary conditions and intimate contact was a disaster for public health, though at the time few understood why so many were falling ill. Even after the Black Death devastated Europe, killing nearly a third of the population, the connection between cleanliness and disease was misunderstood. People believed that strong smells, called miasmas, carried disease, not bacteria. Ironically, many thought that water opened up the body to these foul airs, leading some regions to eventually abandon bathing altogether out of fear, pushing hygiene practices backward even further. In rare cases, some bathhouses did attempt to boil water, usually in copper or iron cauldrons before transferring it into stone tubs. But with no method for consistent reheating and no drainage systems to change the water between guests, this was often symbolic more than sanitary. The illusion of heat did little to combat the slow bacterial bloom that churned quietly beneath the surface. The bathhouse, for all its cultural and spiritual significance, was a place where the body could be exposed not just to warmth and social closeness, but to a silent enemy. The cost of heating water to safety was simply too high, and the cost of not doing so was paid in rashes, infections, and epidemics that tore through communities. Today, when we turn on a tap and expect clean, hot water in seconds, it's easy to forget that this was once a privilege available to almost no one. That comfortable warmth we take for granted, sterile, safe, and reliable, was for centuries a fantasy. In those long-ago bathhouses, surrounded by steam and laughter, the true warmth wasn't in the water. It was in the illusion. And under that illusion, danger simmered quietly, waiting. Priests and moralists declared bathing sinful. Imagine a time when stepping into a bath wasn't just considered indulgent. It was seen as sinful. By the 14th century, public bathing in much of Europe had come under fire not for reasons of hygiene, but for morality. Priests, theologians, and moral reformers warned that to cleanse the body was to endanger the soul. Bathhouses, once places of refreshment and community, were transformed in the eyes of the church into dens of temptation, gateways to lust, and breeding grounds for moral corruption. In the earlier centuries, the tradition of public bathing in Europe had been inherited from the Romans. Bathhouses flourished during the early medieval period, particularly in monastic communities where cleanliness was seen as next to godliness. Monks often bathed regularly, and many monasteries were equipped with elaborate bath systems. However, by the High and Late Middle Ages, the tide began to turn. The Church grew increasingly suspicious of the body, and with it, the act of bathing. Theologians argued that excessive concern for physical cleanliness was a form of vanity. More critically, they feared that bathhouses, with their steamy, dimly lit interiors and mixed-gender patrons, were facilitating sinful behavior. Many bathhouses did indeed offer more than just a soak. Some evolved into places where sex was sold alongside soap, blurring the line between hygiene and hedonism. This reality fueled a moral panic that reshaped public perception. Preachers began to speak out. In sermons, they described bathhouses as places of indecency and sin. Men and women bathing together, even if clothed in linen shifts, was condemned. The proximity of naked flesh, the relaxation of social norms, and the lack of oversight were seen as invitations to lustful thoughts and adulterous actions. In some cities, the church pushed for stricter regulations, demanding gender segregation, earlier closing hours, or outright closures. This moral condemnation had ripple effects. Bathhouses began to lose their respectability. People feared being associated with them, not because of health risks, but because of what others might think. A visit to the bathhouse could be interpreted as a visit to a brothel. Respectable citizens, eager to protect their reputations, withdrew from public bathing culture. Private baths were rare, so, for many, this meant bathing less, or not at all. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, only reinforced these changes. With little understanding of disease transmission, some church leaders argued that bathing, by opening the pores, made the body more susceptible to plague. Thus, abstaining from bathing was presented not just as morally upright, but as a matter of survival. The fear of immorality and the fear of death became intertwined, and water, once a symbol of renewal, was now a suspected vector of sin and decay. The association between bathing and sin deepened further in the 15th and 16th centuries, particularly during the Protestant Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther, while not entirely against hygiene, emphasized inner purity over outer cleanliness. Calvinist communities, in particular, promoted austerity and discipline, often regarding public pleasures like bathing as frivolous or decadent. The emphasis shifted from the cleansing of the body to the cleansing of the soul, reinforcing the notion that excessive attention to the flesh was spiritually dangerous. In Catholic regions, the suspicion persisted as well. The Counter-Reformation brought renewed scrutiny of morality and public behavior. Confessors were instructed to question the faithful about their bathing habits, not to ensure cleanliness, but to root out scandal. Bathhouse owners were accused of facilitating vice. Some establishments were shut down entirely, others were forced to impose strict rules, separate facilities by gender, and even prohibit conversation between bathers. Artists and writers of the period reflected these anxieties. In literature, bathhouses were depicted as liminal spaces, neither entirely public nor private, safe nor dangerous. They became metaphors for moral ambiguity. In paintings, biblical themes like Susanna and the Elders warned of the dangers of voyeurism and the vulnerability of women in such spaces. The image of the bath shifted in the cultural imagination, from a place of rejuvenation to one of temptation. By the 17th century, the once vibrant culture of communal bathing had faded in much of Europe. While some cities maintained spas and mineral baths for the elite, the average citizen bathed infrequently. Instead, they turned to dry cleaning methods, changing linen more often, applying perfumes, or using powders to mask body odor. The irony is sharp. Fearing sin, they embraced filth. Of course, not all regions embraced this puritanical view. In the Islamic world, for example, public bathing remained both a religious and social norm. The hammam was a place of ritual purification and health, with strict hygiene protocols. Travelers from Christian Europe often remarked on how clean and orderly these baths were, in stark contrast to their own dwindling and morally scrutinized establishments. It would take centuries for Western Europe to rediscover the importance of hygiene and to decouple bathing from sin. Only with the advent of modern medicine and the acceptance of germ theory in the 19th century did public health once again champion regular bathing. But even then, the stigma lingered. Old ideas die hard. The belief that the body is somehow shameful, that cleanliness must always defer to modesty, persisted in subtle ways. What began as a religious impulse to promote virtue had paradoxically led to a public culture that tolerated and even encouraged dirt. In trying to avoid the sins of the flesh, society neglected the flesh entirely. And in doing so, they invited disease, discomfort, and the very moral decay they feared, not through excess, but through ignorance. The bath, once a sacred act of cleansing, had become a battleground of belief. And for centuries, that belief stained the water far more deeply than any dirt ever could. People used aromatic herbs to cover up the stench, not to cleanse. The scent of rosemary drifted through the steam, mingling with the earthy aromas of thyme, sage, and lavender. In the low light of medieval bathhouses, bunches of aromatic herbs hung from rafters or floated on the surface of tepid water. They created an illusion of cleanliness, of freshness, of health. But underneath that floral facade lay a darker truth. These herbs didn't cleanse, they didn't purify. They merely masked the stench of filth that clung to the human body and soaked into every stone, every wooden bench, and every reused towel. In the medieval world, soap was not widely available, and where it existed, it was a crude and costly product made from animal fat and lye, often harsh on the skin. Most peasants and even many urban dwellers never used it. Instead, the prevailing belief was that warm water, sweat, and natural elements like herbs were sufficient for cleansing. But this belief had more to do with masking than hygiene. Bathing became an olfactory ritual. Bundles of herbs were boiled in water or tied into muslin sacks and steeped like tea in the tubs. Bathers rubbed them on their skin, not to kill germs, which they didn't understand, but to transfer a pleasant smell. Rose petals, chamomile, and mint were popular for their fragrance. Juniper berries, known to repel fleas, were also used. Sometimes people would crush the herbs against their skin, leaving behind oily residues. But the underlying dirt, sweat, and bacteria remained, clinging to the pores like a second skin. The stench of the human body in a time without proper sewage systems, clean clothing, or medical knowledge was immense. People lived with it daily. Streets reeked of waste, homes smelled of smoke and mold, and bodies carried the scent of labor, of fear, of decay. In this context, herbs offered not just a sensory reprieve, but a psychological one. They gave the illusion of control in a world filled with plague and death. In monasteries, where records were meticulously kept, monks often described elaborate herbal preparations used for bathing rituals. Some believed that certain herbs could draw disease from the body. But these beliefs were based in humoral theory, the ancient idea that health was governed by the balance of bodily fluids. Sage was said to dry, damp humors. Lavender was believed to calm the nerves and reduce melancholy. Bay leaves were thought to protect against curses. The function of these herbs was more spiritual than sanitary. Without any understanding of microbiology, people didn't know that rubbing herbs on the body did nothing to eliminate the colonies of bacteria multiplying on their skin. In fact, by steeping herbs in lukewarm reused bathwater, they may have contributed to a bacterial bloom. The organic material provided food for microbes, making the bathwater even more fertile for disease. And yet, the ritual persisted. In cities like Bath in England or Baden in Switzerland, wealthy patrons paid handsomely for access to public baths infused with herbs. Herbalists crafted specialized mixtures. Some claimed to stimulate virility. Others were marketed as warding off plague. The appeal of these aromatic concoctions was as much about social status as it was about health. A body perfumed with rosemary or cloves was seen as refined, while smelling of sweat marked one as poor. For women especially, the use of herbs was tied to expectations of purity and virtue. Brides were bathed in floral waters before marriage. Midwives washed newborns in chamomile or calendula to protect their spirit. The smell of herbs became a cultural signal, suggesting gentility, even sanctity. But again, none of it addressed the actual sanitation of the body. Some apothecaries and early physicians began experimenting with herb-based disinfectants, especially during outbreaks of disease. Vinegar steeped with herbs, known as four thieves vinegar, was used to wash hands or wipe surfaces. But these practices were exceptions, not the norm. Most people clung to the notion that if they smelled good, they were clean. That belief lingered for centuries. The irony is stark. People immersed themselves in baths filled with tepid, reused water, added herbs for fragrance, and came out thinking they were healthier, when in fact they might have been more vulnerable than before. The herbs didn't remove lice or bacteria. They didn't cleanse the skin of oils or pathogens. They just overpowered the nose. Even royalty partook in these rituals. Queen Elizabeth I was said to bathe monthly and to favor rose water. But her physicians noted skin conditions, ulcers, and signs of poor hygiene common to the time. In courts across Europe, scented oils and powders were used daily, not for health but for image. To smell sweet was to appear clean, even if the body underneath remained untouched by true soap or scrub. Eventually, as medical understanding improved and soap production became industrialized in the 18th and 19th centuries, the role of herbs shifted. They moved from primary cleanser to aesthetic luxury, an addition to truly clean water and antiseptics. But for centuries before that, they were the medieval world's answer to a problem it didn't yet understand: invisible illness, microscopic invasion, and the true nature of cleanliness. In today's world, where antibacterial soap, hot showers, and filtered water are part of daily life, it's difficult to imagine a time when cleanliness was judged by scent alone. But that was the reality. To bathe in medieval Europe was not to become clean. It was to emerge smelling less offensive. A mask of mint and rosemary over a body still covered in the world's filth. Aromatic herbs were not agents of hygiene. They were medieval perfume, psychological armor against the overwhelming stench of disease, decay, and death. And while they brought momentary comfort, they did little to protect against the epidemics that shaped history. They were, in the end, the fragrance of denial, floral whispers that covered the rot. Ritual scraping could tear skin and invite infection. In the quiet steam of ancient and medieval bathhouses, where ritual met relaxation, a particular practice was carried out with unspoken reverence and unseen risk. Bathers seeking cleanliness and purification often underwent scraping rituals using metal strigils or coarse cloths. This wasn't a gentle spa treatment. It was an abrasive, almost aggressive act, carried out with the intent of removing dirt, oil, and dead skin. But it came at a cost, one that history only whispers through wounds long healed. Because these scraping rituals could tear skin, and once that barrier was broken, something invisible slipped in: disease. These scraping tools were no delicate instruments. Strigils, typically shaped like curved blades, were designed to dig into the skin, dragging with them everything from sweat to surface debris. The motion was repeated over and over, pressing into flesh softened by hours in the warm baths. The effect was immediate. Skin appeared cleaner, pores clearer, but often at a microscopic price. The outer barrier of protection, the stratum corneum, was disrupted, sometimes visibly scraped away, often invisibly torn. In Roman and Byzantine traditions, the act of scraping was ceremonial. Athletes did it after training. Nobles had servants to perform it as part of a larger purification rite. In medieval Europe, it became part of monastic cleansing routines and public bathing rituals. Rough cloths were used when metal was not available, but the intention was the same: scrape hard, clean, deep. Yet in all these cases, few considered what else might be lurking in the bathhouse: unclean water, shared basins, reused towels, damp benches, and air heavy with human breath. Water in public bathhouses was seldom fresh. Reused throughout the day, it carried the sweat, filth, and bodily fluids of every previous bather. Even if the water looked clear, it was often teeming with microbial life. Microscopic bacteria, some benign, others deadly, swirled unseen in every ladle poured over freshly scraped skin. A simple scratch from a strigil, a tiny nick from rough cloth, created a perfect gateway. Open skin met contaminated water, and infection was given its invitation. Historical records, though limited in medical detail, do describe outbreaks of fevered wounds and rotting flesh in communities near heavily used bathhouses. These weren't always blamed on the baths, of course. Disease was seen through the lens of miasmas or divine punishment. But with hindsight, the clues are clearer. Staphylococcus bacteria, commonly present on skin and surfaces, could easily exploit the cuts made by scraping. In the worst cases, such wounds festered, turned septic, and led to what we now recognize as cellulitis, abscesses, or even death by systemic infection. There is something deeply ironic about the idea of purification through violence. The scraping rituals were born of a desire to cleanse, to rid the body of impurities. But the very tools of cleanliness became agents of contamination. The harder one tried to become clean, the greater the risk of infection. And all of it unfolded in rooms echoing with laughter, whispers, and steam, the signs of civilization layered over an undercurrent of microbial warfare. In some cultures, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, oils were applied before the scraping, meant to ease the drag and protect the skin. Yet even these oils, shared from communal jars handled by dozens, could be contaminated. A jar left open beside a damp bench was a petri dish waiting to happen. Thus, what was intended to be protective became another vector of harm. The problem was compounded by a lack of understanding of wound care. Cuts weren't cleaned with sterile solutions or treated with antibiotics. They were sometimes sealed with ash, vinegar, or wine. In some regions, wounds were left exposed to air, believed to heal better without covering. But in a bathhouse filled with humidity and human contact, that exposure only invited more bacteria. Despite the dangers, the practice continued for centuries. Scraping was seen as invigorating, as a marker of status, as a sign of spiritual discipline. People tolerated the pain, the bleeding, even the infections, because the ritual meant more than hygiene. It was about control, about shedding layers of not just dirt, but weakness, laziness, and moral decay. And so, body after body was scraped raw, not with malice, but with intention and ignorance. We look back now and shudder at the thought. Metal scraping across skin, dirty water running into open wounds, the scent of unwashed towels reused again and again, the air thick with steam and bacteria. But we also see a profound human truth that the pursuit of purity, when not tempered by science, can become its own kind of disease. The medieval bather believed that they were cleansing sin, strengthening their body, aligning themselves with divine order. But beneath the surface, parasites, bacteria, and infection waited. Today, the strigil exists mostly in museums, a bronze artifact of a forgotten ritual. But its echoes remain, in harsh skincare routines, in detox trends, in the belief that suffering must accompany cleansing. We may have antibiotics and clean water now, but the psychological impulse to scrub away what is impure, no matter the cost, still lingers. In the end, the bathhouses that echoed with scraping metal and dripping water were not just sanctuaries of peace, but theaters of unintended harm. The same steam that opened pores opened gateways. The same towel that wiped away sweat passed on contagion. And the same scraping blade that peeled away grime often invited something far worse to take its place. Cleanliness, they believed, was next to godliness. But too often it led them closer to something far more earthly, pain, infection, and the fragility of the body they tried so hard to purify. Bathhouses became prime targets during plague outbreaks. The smell of soap and the sound of splashing once signaled comfort, but during plague outbreaks they summoned dread. The bathhouse, once a center of community and cleansing, became a feared incubator of death. In medieval Europe, particularly during the Black Death of the 14th century, bathhouses were increasingly viewed not as sanctuaries, but as threats. And in a cruel twist of irony, the fear was not entirely unfounded. At the peak of the Black Death, fear gripped every corner of Europe. No one knew what caused it. Not rats, not fleas, not the Yersinia pestis bacterium. Theories swirled through every class of society. Miasma, bad air, was one of the most widely believed explanations. It was thought that disease drifted on foul-smelling vapors, invisible clouds of poison that clung to breath and fabric. And what better breeding ground for such air than a bathhouse? A sealed chamber filled with steam, sweat, and the naked bodies of strangers. Communal bathing had been a cornerstone of urban life for centuries. From Roman thermae to medieval stews, these spaces were more than hygiene. They were hubs of social, economic, and even romantic exchange. But their very openness, shared towels, still pools, low ventilation, became a curse in the time of plague. Fear began to spread faster than the disease itself. And so did the targeting. In Paris, officials began closing public bathhouses en masse. Not just due to miasma theories, but because the plague seemed to follow their patrons. Those who bathed regularly began falling ill. In Florence, bathhouse owners were accused of harboring death. In some towns, mobs attacked bathhouse buildings, torching them in the belief that they were plague factories. Walls once built for relaxation were smashed with rocks. Steam vents were blocked with dirt. It wasn't just fear, it was desperation. But not all reactions were blind panic. Some physicians of the time noticed patterns. In a world without modern science, they relied on observation. And what they saw disturbed them. People who bathed during outbreaks sometimes fared worse. One theory recorded in 14th century medical texts suggested that hot water opened the pores, allowing bad air to seep into the body. By contrast, cool and dry skin was believed to be a kind of armor, so the act of bathing, especially in hot rooms, was seen as an invitation to death. There were also class dynamics. The wealthy had private baths. The poor went to communal ones. So when illness took root in the slums, it was the public bathhouse that became the symbol of danger, regardless of hygiene. And when the rich fled to the countryside, they left behind the very places they once frequented. In their absence, suspicion grew. The bathhouse became a ghost, abandoned, feared, and blamed. Ironically, some of these fears were partially accurate. While the plague's main transmission was through fleas on rats, the unsanitary conditions of some bathhouses, stagnant water, reused linens, poor drainage, could indeed spread other diseases. Typhus, skin infections, even tuberculosis. Enclosed heat without ventilation can be a haven for bacteria. And while the plague may not have originated there, illness certainly found fertile ground in their warm, wet walls. By the 15th century, the bathhouse was in decline across much of Europe, not just because of the plague, but because of what it came to represent. Disease, decay, danger. The very idea of communal nakedness became linked with moral and physical risk. Bathhouses were shut down, repurposed, or left to rot. The cultural shift was massive, centuries of social custom erased by a single biological terror. In some cities, like London and Bruges, the ruins of bathhouses still stand, their tiled floors silent, their drains dry. Their ghosts linger not in haunting, but in warning, that even spaces of comfort can turn lethal in the right storm. That fear, once lit, can dismantle centuries of tradition. In Nuremberg, local records from the early 1350s mention fines imposed on bathhouse operators for failing to close their doors during times of pestilence. The implication was clear. The bathhouse was not neutral. It was dangerous. A vector. Some towns passed emergency ordinances requiring anyone who bathed to change garments entirely afterward. No reusing of clothing, no lingering. Yet these rules often came too late, and the fear continued to outpace the facts. Priests warned against heat. Physicians recommended vinegar baths in private tubs if one had to wash at all. A bizarre custom even arose in some parts of Eastern Europe, smearing the body with olive oil or animal fat instead of water, then scraping it off with a dull blade. This, they said, sealed the pores, protected against the air of death. Cleanliness had been redefined, from bathing to avoidance, and in the margins of forgotten texts you find rumors of bathhouse workers going missing, of supposed plague witches accused of poisoning the stone benches, of physicians who vanished after tracing too many cases back to one place. The heat, they said, clouded more than the air, it clouded intent. And so the bathhouse slowly disappeared from the Western world for centuries. Not because it failed to clean, but because it became too closely tied to the one thing humanity could not cleanse away, its fear of the unseen. Now when we walk through the ruins or see tiled mosaics beneath our cities, we rarely think of this legacy. But it's there. History, after all, isn't just preserved in monuments. It's hidden in the things we abandoned, in the echoes of steam, fear, and silence. The plague didn't just reshape cities. It reshaped how we see the very act of being clean. Communal bathing often included food, drink, and alcohol, leading to violence. In the steamy glow of bathhouse lanterns, where mist clung to the ceiling and the scent of oils mixed with human sweat, a different kind of gathering unfolded. Across medieval Europe and parts of Asia, the bathhouse was not just a place of cleanliness. It was the social nucleus of urban life. People bathed together, talked politics, negotiated business, flirted, and feasted. But under this steamy veneer of civility and leisure, something far more chaotic often brewed. The communal bath became a place not just of hygiene, but of conflict, a volatile cocktail of alcohol, pride, and hot air that could boil over at any moment. In the early centuries of bathhouse culture, especially in Roman times and later during the medieval period, bathing was considered a deeply social event. Families, travelers, scholars, merchants, and even clergy entered these steaming halls to cleanse and converse. By the time of the 13th and 14th centuries, bathhouses had evolved into elaborate complexes that included changing rooms, dining areas, and even beds for resting. It wasn't long before the inclusion of food and drink became not just a pleasure, but an expected part of the experience. In larger cities like Paris, Prague, or Vienna, bathhouses competed for clientele not just with warm waters, but with culinary indulgences. Platters of roasted meats, dried fruits, cheeses, and freshly baked breads were brought into the steamy chambers. Wine flowed freely, mulled with spices in the winter or chilled with snow when available. Beer, a staple of the working class, was served in large wooden mugs, sometimes passed between strangers sitting side by side in the same tub. As alcohol flowed and the heat relaxed muscles and lowered inhibitions, tensions often flared. The communal atmosphere, so open and raw, exposed social divisions that lingered even beneath the surface of shared water. Inhibitions melted away with the steam. Arguments, once quiet or teasing, grew loud. Jealousy sparked over flirtatious glances. Business rivalries turned into drunken accusations. What began as a leisurely soak could turn into a violent confrontation within seconds. Tools meant for bathing, wooden ladles, water buckets, long-handled scrubbing brushes became weapons in a moment of rage. Hot stones used to warm the rooms or heat the water could be hurled or pressed against flesh. There are historical records from 14th century municipal archives in Germany and Italy describing violent incidents in bathhouses, some resulting in injury or even death. These weren't isolated events. They were frequent enough to cause concern among city officials. In Cologne, a decree was passed in the 1380s restricting the sale of wine within bathhouses after a particularly gruesome fight left a man dead from a crushed skull. In Florence, certain bathhouses were temporarily shut down due to repeated drunken altercations. And in London, the stews, bathhouses near the River Thames, developed reputations for not only prostitution, but for being hotbeds of disorder, where fights broke out with alarming regularity. The architecture of these establishments didn't help. Rooms were often circular or rectangular chambers packed with people, with low visibility from the foggy air and poor lighting. Sound echoed and bounced. One raised voice could spark confusion in the next chamber. A splash might be mistaken for a shove. When people are nearly naked, vulnerable, and armed with alcohol and pride, it doesn't take much for chaos to ignite. In addition to physical violence, the emotional intensity in these spaces often led to psychological confrontations. Envy, shame, lust, anger, emotions heightened in the vulnerable context of group nudity and intoxication. Mixed-gender bathing, though banned or frowned upon in some regions, was common in others, especially in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. That mingling added fuel to already smoldering situations, as romantic rivalries, jealous lovers, and unreciprocated advances sometimes led to public confrontations. Authorities attempted regulation. In Nuremberg and Augsburg, ordinances were drafted forbidding certain behaviors: gambling, intoxication, overt sexual acts, and bringing in outside alcohol. But enforcement was lax. Bathhouse owners, eager to maintain business, rarely imposed rules unless a serious incident occurred. Many establishments hired guards or enforcers, but even they were often more focused on protecting property than people. Despite the dangers, bathhouses remained popular. Their social function outweighed the risks. For many, the bathhouse was one of the only escapes from the filth and cold of medieval urban life. It was warm, filled with laughter and stories, food and wine, a place where the body and the spirit could both be indulged. And for some, the danger was part of the appeal. A place where boundaries blurred, where people were raw and exposed, not just in skin, but in emotion. By the 16th century, bathhouse culture began to change. The rise of syphilis and shifting moral attitudes, particularly in Protestant regions, caused many bathhouses to close or become strictly segregated. The open indulgence of food, drink, and naked socializing faded. Private bathing slowly replaced the public rituals of old. But in their heyday, bathhouses were wild, unpredictable arenas of humanity, where warmth could comfort or combust, and where a mug of wine could be followed by a strike of a hot stone. Today, we bathe in silence, often alone, in pristine tiles and chlorinated water. The modern spa is a descendant of those steamy, raucous gatherings, but it bears little resemblance in spirit. The violence is gone, the feasting forgotten, the danger erased. But if you listen closely in an old European city, near the ruins of a medieval bath, you might still hear echoes of laughter, or the clash of wine-soaked pride turning to rage deep beneath the surface of the water. Some bathhouses had no drainage, water just soaked the floor. Imagine stepping into a bathhouse not to cleanse, but to wade through filth. Picture wooden planks slick with body fluids, cloudy water pooling at your feet, and the unmistakable stench of rot rising with every step. This was the reality in many bathhouses across medieval and early modern Europe, where infrastructure was rudimentary and drainage, if it existed at all, was an afterthought. In some of the most crowded, heavily frequented bathhouses, water was not drained between patrons. In fact, it was rarely drained at all. While today we associate bathhouses with pristine tile and carefully filtered hot tubs, the historical reality could not be more different. Especially in the poorer quarters of urban centers, bathhouses were often little more than shacks built atop soaked wooden beams. There was no underground sewage system to carry away the waste, no pipes to flush the used water out of sight. Instead, water overflowed the tubs, leaked from wooden basins, and spilled across uneven floors. And it didn't go anywhere. It just stayed there, absorbed by the wood, by straw, by dirt, creating a swamp of sickness underfoot. The concept of drainage was not unknown to ancient civilizations. The Romans, for example, had complex aqueducts and sewer systems that served their public baths. But by the time these engineering marvels had crumbled under the weight of empire collapse, the knowledge and infrastructure to maintain hygienic public bathing vanished with them. Medieval cities, rebuilt in layers atop old ruins, rarely revived such efficient systems. Bathhouses were built without planning for water disposal. The result? A perfect environment for disease. Visitors to these bathhouses often went barefoot. It was customary. Shoes were seen as dirty and inappropriate for spaces meant for cleanliness. Ironically, this tradition ensured that every step carried the risk of infection. Cracks in the skin became gateways for disease, fungal infections, parasitic worms, even tetanus. The water underfoot was not merely unsanitary, it was a biological hazard. Historical accounts describe bathhouse floors blackened with mildew and slippery with grime. Some reports mention mats of straw laid over soaked boards to absorb excess liquid, but these too became saturated and festering. Staff could not clean the floors thoroughly. There was no way to dry them completely, no modern tools to sterilize or disinfect. At best, workers would sweep away visible debris, perhaps sprinkle herbs or burn incense to mask the odors, but the microbial swamp beneath remained. And bathhouses weren't just exposed to water. People brought their ailments with them: boils, open wounds, skin diseases. In some cities, bathhouses doubled as rudimentary medical clinics, with barbers or attendants lancing abscesses, extracting lice, or applying poultices right beside the soaking pools. The fluids from these treatments, blood, pus, and excrement, had nowhere to go. They ran into the same undrained, rotting floorboards shared by dozens of other bare feet. In the winter, dampness turned to ice. Patrons would slip and fall, often worsening wounds they came in with. In the summer, the heat intensified the stench, attracting insects and rats. Vermin thrived in the bathhouse ecosystem, feeding on scraps, nesting in rotting floor mats, and spreading disease between patrons unseen. Bathhouse owners were often limited by resources. Wealthier establishments in major cities might have rudimentary drains that led to open sewers or cesspools, but even these were subject to clogging and overflow. The smell of ammonia, human waste, and stagnant water permeated the air. It wasn't uncommon for bathers to vomit upon entering due to the overwhelming odor. Still, for many, the bathhouse was the only available option for cleansing and socializing. And despite the conditions, bathhouses remained popular. They were places of community and escape, where people could momentarily forget the squalor of their homes. The steam, the warmth, the chance to converse, to gossip, or simply to feel human. It outweighed the dangers for many. But those dangers were real. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery and typhoid spread easily. Skin infections passed from person to person, not just in the pools, but across the floor. City officials occasionally attempted to regulate the worst offenders. Edicts were issued to enforce cleaning, to improve drainage, to mandate inspections. But corruption, underfunding, and lack of knowledge about disease made enforcement inconsistent. Some bathhouses cleaned up, others simply bribed inspectors or operated in secret. In times of plague, many were closed altogether, considered more a threat than a remedy. By the Enlightenment era, public health reforms began to recognize the necessity of proper drainage. The link between waste and disease became more widely accepted, especially as scientific observation replaced superstition. Plumbing became a priority in the design of new urban spaces, and with it came the understanding that water, once symbolic of purity, could become poison when left to stagnate. The contrast to today's standards could not be sharper. We view hygiene as a right, sanitation as a foundation of civilization. Yet, for centuries, even the most basic act of washing was fraught with danger. Beneath the soothing promise of warm water lay a trap of human neglect, disease festering in the very spaces built to prevent it. To step into a bathhouse then was not to step into cleanliness, but into risk. The floor beneath your feet held the footprint of every person who came before, along with every wound, every illness, every careless spill. It was not just water soaking the planks, it was history. And history, in this case, reeked. Intimate work was rampant and often forced or exploitative. Imagine walking into a bathhouse not just for warmth or cleanliness, but into a place veiled in shadows, where the line between service and exploitation blurred beyond recognition. In medieval and early modern Europe, many bathhouses doubled as brothels, not by accident, but by design. Behind the scented steam and soothing whispers lay a darker reality, one of coercion, desperation, and abuse. While some patrons came for a bath, others came expecting more, and what they received was often built upon the backs of the most vulnerable. Bathhouses were among the few places where men and women could interact semi-privately under the cover of an acceptable social activity. But that thin veil of propriety concealed systems of exploitation. Girls and young women, many of them from poor families or orphaned by war, famine, or plague, were recruited or forced into intimate work under the pretense of being attendants. They were trained not in the art of healing, but in the art of compliance. Some cities tried to regulate this dual purpose. In parts of Renaissance Italy and 15th century France, authorities taxed bathhouses known to host intimate workers. These establishments operated under euphemisms like stew houses or sweat lodges, and while laws sometimes forbade adult service provider in theory, in practice it was not only tolerated, it was profitable. Officials looked the other way. In some cases, they took a cut. In others, they ran the operations themselves. What made it worse was the illusion of choice. Many girls entered these bathhouses as servants or assistants, fetching towels, preparing oils, or cleaning tubs. But over time, they were pressured into offering more intimate services to clients. Resistance meant dismissal, starvation, or worse. And those who complied were often underage, underfed, and under constant threat. Bathhouse owners profited. Patrons turned a blind eye. Society justified it with silence. Surviving records from the 14th and 15th centuries speak of girls as young as 12 being kept in bathhouses. Some cities tried to impose minimum ages or require registration, but enforcement was inconsistent. A girl's poverty, orphanhood, or foreign origin often sealed her fate. She became part of the steam and silence, seen but not heard, touched but never protected. While some women eventually gained agency, saving money, choosing clients, or becoming mistresses, this was rare. Most remained trapped in a cycle of labor, disease, and exploitation. The same steam that softened skin also softened boundaries. What was offered as healing became a performance, and what was demanded as intimacy was often thinly veiled abuse. And it wasn't only the girls. Boys, too, were occasionally caught in the system, especially in port cities or during times of economic collapse. Desperate families sold children to bathhouse owners. Others were kidnapped or lured in with promises of food and shelter. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. They were kept under watch, sometimes behind closed rooms or underground chambers. Their identities vanished. Their names were forgotten. Contemporary moralists and priests decried the corruption of bathhouses, but their sermons often targeted the behavior of patrons, not the suffering of the coerced. Few advocated for the victims. Fewer still intervened. And even those who tried were often shouted down by merchants, nobles, or even kings who enjoyed these services and had no intention of giving them up. The diseases that spread through these interactions, syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections, were seen as divine punishment, not public health crises. The women were blamed for spreading vice, even as they had no control over what happened to them. Their bodies became battlegrounds for judgment, commerce, and survival. The bathhouse, once a place of supposed purification, had become a theater of exploitation. In art and literature, this duality was hinted at but rarely confronted. Poets described the allure of the bather's touch. Painters depicted the sensuality of steam and skin. But few dared to paint the bruises, the fatigue, the numbness behind the eyes of the girls, forced to smile. The world romanticized what it refused to reckon with. Beneath the candlelight and tiled walls, lives were being used up, quietly, legally, invisibly. It wasn't until the rise of organized health and morality campaigns in the 18th and 19th centuries that bathhouse-based adult service provider began to be addressed seriously. Governments cracked down, not out of compassion, but out of fear of disease, of scandal, of public unrest. Many bathhouses were shuttered or sanitized. Some were turned into hospitals or clinics. Others were simply erased, their histories scrubbed like dirt from stone. But even today, echoes remain. In some parts of the world, similar establishments exist under different names. Vulnerable individuals, especially girls, are still trafficked under the guise of service. The pattern is ancient. The architecture may change, but the exploitation adapts. To truly understand the history of bathhouses, we must look beyond the steam and elegance. We must see the ghosts that linger in those tiled rooms. Young voices silenced by heat and shame, bodies reduced to transactions, futures stolen beneath the scent of lavender and eucalyptus. This is not just history. It is a warning about the price of ignoring those who serve, about the dangers of comfort built on suffering. The bathwater may have soothed the skin, but it also washed away names, rights, and lives. And for every story that survived, countless more were lost, dissolved in silence as easily as steam. Boils, rashes, and open wounds were washed in the same tub. Imagine walking into a bustling public bathhouse in the heart of medieval Europe. Steam rises from enormous wooden tubs. The scent of herbs lingers in the air, lavender, sage, rosemary. But beneath it all is something less fragrant, the unspoken truth that the water is not clean. It has been used and reused all day, soaking dozens of bodies. And not just any bodies. Some are healthy, but others arrive with boils oozing across their backs, open wounds festering at the knees, strange rashes crawling up their arms. And all of it is being washed into the same tub. In the medieval world, bathing was not just about hygiene. It was ritual, community, healing, even morality. Yet their understanding of cleanliness was limited to what the eyes could see. They had no concept of microscopic life. Germs, bacteria, and viruses were unknown, and so the practice of sharing bath water was not questioned. Water was expensive to heat and difficult to replenish. In most bathhouses, it was standard procedure to keep it for the entire day, allowing person after person to descend into what quickly became a tepid broth of skin, sweat, and disease. The sick were not excluded, In fact, they were often welcomed, particularly in religious communities that saw caring for the infirm as a moral duty. Some bathhouses were attached to monasteries or charitable orders, where the diseased and injured were allowed to soak their wounds in communal tubs. Pus, blood, and shed skin floated alongside flower petals and soap. No one suspected that this sacred act of mercy might also be an act of mass contamination. Boils were a common affliction. They were painful, pus-filled lesions caused by bacterial infections, most often Staphylococcus aureus. When these boils burst, their contents spilled into the bathwater, turning it into an infectious soup. The warm temperature only accelerated bacterial growth. And because everyone used the same towels and sat on the same benches, the pathogens didn't stay in the tub. They followed each bather home, clinging to clothing and skin. Rashes, too, were everywhere. Scabies caused by tiny mites could spread by simple contact. Fungal infections like ringworm and bacterial ones like impetigo thrived in damp, shared environments. The bathhouse offered the perfect conditions: warmth, moisture, and constant human contact. Even something as simple as drying off with a reused cloth could lead to weeks of torment. In these spaces, to seek relief was to gamble with one's health. And then there was leprosy. Feared, stigmatized, misunderstood. Though leper colonies existed, many early or undiagnosed cases slipped through the cracks. Lepers were not always isolated. In their earliest stages, leprosy might look like a rash, a sore, a dry patch of skin, nothing dramatic. And in the communal bathhouse, where clothes were shed and differences blurred in the steam, no one could tell where illness ended and normal skin began. The very architecture of the bathhouse contributed to the risk. Wooden tubs absorbed fluids. Cracks and seams became breeding grounds for microbes. Stone benches held moisture. Curtains and towels were rarely washed properly, only rinsed or aired out. Each object became a silent carrier of disease. But because the bathhouse felt sacred, people believed it was safe. They trusted the warmth, the oils, the rituals. They believed in what they could see and smell. They did not know the dangers floated unseen in the water. There are stories from the time, vague, frightened descriptions in diaries and letters, of strange fevers that followed a trip to the bathhouse, of wounds that healed more slowly, of entire neighborhoods developing similar rashes after feast days when public bathing peaked. People whispered of curses and bad omens. They never suspected the culprit was the water itself. Some cities attempted reforms. In a few wealthy towns, bathhouse operators were instructed to change the water more frequently. But such acts were expensive, and enforcement was lax. In poorer areas, tubs were seldom emptied. Herbal mixtures were added to mask the scent of decay. But nothing truly addressed the root problem. The water was never clean, not after the first bather, and certainly not after the 50th. There is a dark irony in it all. The very places meant to restore the body often hastened its decline. Bathhouses were designed as spaces of healing, of purity, of escape from filth. And yet they became epicenters of skin-borne infections, flesh-eating diseases, and long-lasting scars. And worse, they offered no warning. No smell, no pain, no immediate sign. Just warm water, candlelight, conversation, and slow infection. Today we take clean water for granted, but this privilege was born from centuries of suffering, from the slow realization that not all water purifies. That cleanliness must be more than ritual, it must be real. The ancient bathers didn't know better. They followed the best practices of their time, but history reveals the cost of that ignorance. So the next time you picture a medieval bathhouse, steamy, silent, softly lit, look closer. See the wounds beneath the water, the faces marked with illness, the towels soaked in someone else's blood. See the mercy that unknowingly spread disease. And remember that the pursuit of cleanliness without knowledge can leave you dirtier than you began. In the end, they bathed to heal, but they shared the tub with disease. And in doing so, they passed it from hand to hand, body to body, breath to breath, until even the cleanest flesh carried the hidden weight of someone else's suffering. Bathers shared cloths to dry off. We often romanticize the past. Imagine marble baths, fragrant oils, and steamy relaxation. But step beyond the mosaics and you'll find something far less idyllic. Picture a crowded medieval bathhouse, steam thick as fog, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. You emerge from the water, skin warm, lungs heavy, and you reach for a towel. But there are none, or at least none that are yours. What lies nearby is a used cloth, damp, wrung out by someone you've never met. You hesitate, but everyone's doing it. This isn't luxury, it's survival. In the communal bathhouses of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, shared cloths were as essential as water itself. There were rarely enough to go around. Linens were expensive, labor-intensive to wash, and prone to rot. Bathhouses weren't equipped with industrial cleaning methods. Instead, workers relied on hurried rinses in dirty basins, sometimes even reusing the same rinse water for every cloth. Patrons would dry themselves with whatever was within reach. Sometimes not even a towel, but a rag, a corner of a curtain, even a piece of their own clothing. In London's stews, the medieval term for bathhouses, the scene was far from sanitary. A 15th century account described towels as soaked and fouled, yet used again and again. Often they weren't even cloths in the traditional sense, but worn linens repurposed from old bedding, table covers, even discarded shrouds. One visitor to a Parisian bathhouse in the late 1300s noted that the cloth he was handed smelled of onion, sweat, and mold, and that it was so damp it clung to the flesh like wet bread. But this wasn't unusual. It was expected. The science of hygiene as we know it didn't exist. Germ theory was centuries away. People believed in humors, in air, in spirits. Disease came from imbalance, not filth. And so the idea of a clean towel, one not shared, one freshly laundered, was foreign. In many cultures, a cloth was simply a tool, reused until it rotted. Washing happened when stains became visible, not when bacteria were suspected. And in the warm, wet environment of a bathhouse, those reused cloths became breeding grounds. Bacteria love moisture. They thrive in warmth. And while today we understand that sharing unwashed linens can lead to the spread of skin infections, boils, and worse, in earlier eras the connection was invisible. Yet outbreaks of mysterious rashes, oozing sores, and stubborn coughs followed certain bathhouses. Patrons assumed the water was cursed. Few suspected the cloth they pressed to their faces was the real culprit. Even in elite establishments like the Roman thermae or Ottoman hammams, the story wasn't much better. Slaves or servants often handled towels, wringing them out between uses, sometimes using the same cloth for multiple guests. Towels might be rinsed, but rarely boiled or thoroughly dried. In many places, they were stacked in corners, collecting heat, humidity, and microbes. And still the bathers kept coming, not because they were foolish, but because this was all they knew. Cleanliness to them was relative. Better to be freshly scrubbed with a used towel than to walk the streets unwashed. And for many, the bathhouse was not a luxury, but the only opportunity to cleanse, spiritually, socially, physically. It was worth the risk, until the risk became too great. During outbreaks of disease, especially the plague, typhus, or leprosy, public fear shifted. Shared linens came under scrutiny. Physicians began recommending personal towels, though few could afford them. The rich brought their own linens, embroidered, perfumed, and kept far from common use. The poor, meanwhile, continued to reach for whatever was nearby, and illness once again followed the cloth. Historical records mention bathhouse attendants being punished for laundering failures. In some cities, guilds formed to regulate bathhouse hygiene, but enforcement was spotty, and linen was expensive. Cloth was reused because it had to be, and people dried their faces with rags touched by dozens of others, sick, sweating, coughing. In German bathhouses of the 14th century, local records show that some cloths were rotated among as many as 20 guests in a single day. A chronicler from Cologne wrote of bathers leaving with more ailments than they arrived with, though no one understood why. A bathhouse in Prague was shut down in 1378, not due to plague, but due to foul linen and persistent outbreaks of skin rot. The city council cited the cloths which ferment upon the walls as the reason. In Russia's Banya, dried birch branches were used to slap the skin, invigorating the body. But afterward, the same cloth might be shared by the whole household. In Japan, where cloth was sacred and bathing frequent, many townspeople used the same yukata or drying cloth day after day without washing. And in Ottoman Istanbul, the hammam provided towels, if you could afford the better ones. Otherwise, you dried yourself with whatever was left, still warm from someone else's body. What's most haunting isn't just the risk, it's the acceptance. The shared towel wasn't scandalous, it was expected. Everyone used them, everyone smelled the mildew, everyone knew. But with no better alternative, they endured. The towel, in this sense, becomes a symbol of necessity, of ignorance, of survival. It reminds us that progress is not just about medicine or invention, it's about small shifts in what we consider essential. Today, we take clean towels for granted. We expect freshness, we recoil at dampness. But for centuries, humanity pressed damp, sour-smelling cloths to their bodies and called it comfort. And in that shared fabric, layered with sweat, stories, and unseen danger, we find a truth. Cleanliness is a concept we've had to learn, and it came slowly, stitch by stitch. Some cities had over 20 bathhouses operating as illegal adult service provider hubs. In the shadows of medieval Europe's most iconic cities, behind the facade of public health and civic duty, thrived an open secret, one both tolerated and condemned. Bathhouses, intended for cleansing and social gathering, had become front lines for illicit commerce. In cities like London, Paris, and Nuremberg, entire districts were lined with what came to be known as stew houses, bathing establishments that served not just warm water, but flesh and fantasy. Though laws forbade it, these bathhouses evolved into thriving centers of underground adult service provider, and everyone knew. The word stew originally referred to a heated bath. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, it had taken on a darker implication. In London's Southwark district, across the Thames from the city proper, over 20 such stew houses operated openly. They were places where men of every class, merchants, soldiers, nobles, and even clergy, could find companionship under the veil of steam and scented oil. The water offered a place to relax. The real business was what happened after. In many cases, adult service provider was not just present, it was the main attraction. Local governments walked a fine line. Authorities were aware of the stew houses and their dual purpose, but chose tolerance over confrontation. The bathhouses paid taxes, after all, and more importantly, they served as pressure valves, socially sanctioned zones where vice could be contained. In some cities, regulations were introduced not to eliminate adult service provider, but to control it. Stew house workers were often required to register, undergo inspections, or even wear specific garments identifying their trade. It was an attempt at order within chaos, but the rot ran deeper than law. Despite these measures, the bathhouses remained breeding grounds, both socially and biologically. Intimately transmitted infections, especially syphilis, began to surge across Europe in the late 15th century. Though the disease's exact origin is still debated, one fact is clear. Its explosive spread was amplified by the very institutions designed to be discreet. Within stew houses, contact was intimate, sanitation was minimal, and medical understanding was non-existent. When an infected person visited, the disease didn't just linger, it multiplied. The interior of a stew house often resembled a mix between a brothel and a spa. There were soaking tubs lined with cushions, rooms separated by thin curtains, and attendants who did more than offer towels. Candles burned low, perfumes masked the scent of sweat, and music, sometimes live, sometimes hummed, filled the space. Behind all of this was a fragile illusion of cleanliness and care. In truth, many stew houses were poorly ventilated, rarely cleaned, and filled with fabrics and furnishings that absorbed fluids and infection alike. Crime thrived in these humid enclaves. Pickpocketing, blackmail, bribery, many stew houses became hubs of the city's underbelly. Some were used by spies and informants, others by criminals fencing stolen goods under the noses of distracted patrons. And because many were protected by wealthy clients, the stew houses could operate beyond the reach of law. For a coin, a reputation could be destroyed or erased. Secrets were traded in whispers while bodies soaked in the same basin. It was intimacy not just of the flesh, but of influence and power. Despite their dangers, stew houses were immensely popular. They offered what no other institution could: the illusion of freedom. In a world governed by rigid class, gender, and religious expectations, these bathhouses allowed for moments of unstructured desire. For a few coins, one could shed not only clothing, but identity. The merchant became a king, the priest a sinner, the soldier a lover. In this anonymity, people found not just vice, but escape. Yet the consequences were long-lasting. The unchecked spread of venereal disease ravaged entire populations. Syphilis, known then as the Great Pox, was particularly devastating. Symptoms were misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and mistreated. Some believed it to be a curse from God. Others thought it was caused by bad air or immoral behavior. Regardless, the stew houses became scapegoats and eventually symbols of decline. When plagues hit or morality surged, cities cracked down. In London, Henry VIII ordered many stew houses closed. In Paris, edicts were passed forbidding co-ed bathing and impure acts. In Nuremberg, fines and branding were used to deter repeat offenders, but the closures never lasted. As long as there was demand, there would be stew houses, sometimes rebranded, sometimes hidden deeper underground. Adult service provider didn't vanish. It evolved. In later centuries, the bathhouse brothel hybrid would influence the design of pleasure districts across Europe and even colonial cities abroad. The legacy of the medieval stew house, with all its contradictions, never truly disappeared. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine candlelit water, whispered secrets, and forbidden love in steamy rooms. But behind that dream was a reality of exploitation, infection, and corruption. The bathhouses promised warmth, but they delivered far more than heat. They were crucibles of power and pleasure, disease and danger. We remember them not just because they existed, but because they mirrored the societies that built them, torn between purity and indulgence, law and appetite. The stew house was more than a bathhouse. It was a reflection, distorted by steam, of everything a city wanted and everything it tried to hide. Bathhouse employees had no medical training. Imagine entering a bathhouse seeking healing, only to leave with infection, injury, or worse. In the steam-filled chambers of medieval and early modern bathhouses, the line between health and harm was dangerously thin. Behind the soothing aroma of herbs and the promise of skilled hands was a truth far less reassuring. Most bathhouse employees had no medical training whatsoever. Yet they performed massages, drained abscesses, administered poultices, and sometimes even lanced wounds, all without sterilization, knowledge of anatomy, or any understanding of infection. These attendants were often seen as a hybrid of servant, healer, and entertainer. They offered massages that were believed to stimulate blood flow and purge illness. They rubbed oils into skin to treat rashes or swelling. They scraped calluses with tools, cupped the skin to extract bad humors, and claimed to realign bones and muscles. But these claims were based more on tradition and superstition than any actual understanding of anatomy or hygiene. Unlike trained physicians, who were few, expensive, and usually reserved for the elite, bathhouse workers served the common people. And while their intentions may have been sincere, the consequences were often disastrous. Tools were reused between patrons without being washed. Blades used to lance boils were dipped in the same basin of water. Cloths used for cleaning wounds were wrung out and reused. Open wounds were touched by bare hands. And all of this took place in humid, unventilated environments that bred disease like a greenhouse breeds rot. The belief in humoral medicine played a large role. Sickness was thought to result from imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Bathhouse treatments aimed to restore balance, not by killing bacteria, which no one knew existed, but by drawing out excess humors. Sweating was considered healthy. Bloodletting, cupping, and induced vomiting were all part of the same logic. An attendant might place leeches on a customer's back without knowing how to monitor the outcome, or worse, without knowing when to stop. Because bathing was communal and social, stories of miracle healing spread easily. Someone claimed a sore vanished after a eucalyptus steam. Another swore a backache disappeared after a vigorous scrub. Word of mouth did the work of modern advertising. Attendants became minor celebrities in their neighborhoods, praised for their gifted hands, even as they unknowingly passed on disease. And because many patrons couldn't afford physicians or didn't trust them, bathhouse attendants became their only option. Poor mothers brought in children with fevers, hoping a steam bath or oil rub would cure them. Laborers limped in with infected blisters or torn muscles, desperate for relief. Soldiers came with festering wounds. But in most cases, what they received was not medical care. It was trial and error wrapped in confidence and hope. One of the most dangerous practices was the reuse of metal instruments. Knives, lancets, and even crude scalpels were wiped, not sterilized. Infections spread quickly. Bloodborne illnesses like syphilis and hepatitis thrived in these environments. The warm, wet atmosphere turned bathhouses into incubators for every pathogen imaginable. Occasionally, bathhouse attendants would perform minor surgical procedures. They might remove a splinter or a nail, drain a cyst, or lance a boil the size of an orange. Without gloves, without antiseptic, without any real understanding of cross-contamination. The only barrier between patient and wound was the attendant's calloused hand. Any cuts or abrasions on the attendant's skin became silent bridges for disease back and forth between bodies. Worse still, the oils and salves used were often homemade mixtures of herbs, animal fats, and resins, stored in unsealed jars that spoiled quickly. Some even contained toxic substances. Lead-based creams were applied to rashes. Mercury-laced pastes were used for sores. The line between cure and poison was thin, and bathhouse attendants were rarely aware of the difference. And yet, these attendants were trusted. They were part of the neighborhood. Patrons often tipped them extra for a strong rub or a long session. They gave advice like doctors. They performed rituals like priests. They were the healers of the people, not by qualification, but by default. Over time, some cities attempted to regulate the chaos. Local guilds were formed. Bathhouse workers were required to register or undergo inspections. But enforcement was lax, and many operated without oversight. In times of epidemic, bathhouses were blamed as sites of spread. Some were shut down, while others were quietly allowed to reopen due to public demand. People needed them, even if they were dangerous. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as science began to reveal the microbial world, the role of bathhouse attendants diminished. Doctors began condemning the use of shared tools and unclean hands. Hospitals and clinics became more accessible. But even as official medicine rose, the bathhouse attendant lingered, a relic of an era when hope, necessity, and ignorance bathed side by side. To understand this part of history is to realize how fragile health was and how easily trust could become a weapon. The attendants weren't villains. They were often compassionate, skilled with their hands, and committed to their clients. But they were part of a system built on outdated beliefs and missing knowledge. And for many who stepped into those steam-filled rooms, what felt like healing was, in truth, a slow invitation to sickness. They promised relief. They offered comfort. But under the soothing oils and whispered assurances, there was always a risk. Not because they meant harm, but because no one had yet learned how to truly prevent it. People ate in the water. Imagine a place where the boundary between luxury and filth dissolves in steam, where aristocrats sit shoulder to shoulder, not just soaking in hot water, but dining in it. This wasn't fiction. This was history. In the medieval and Renaissance eras, bathhouses were not only sites of cleansing or relaxation, they were full-fledged social arenas. And in many elite circles, they became venues for a bizarre custom, eating while submerged. It might sound absurd today, but across Europe, especially in cities like Paris, Nuremberg, and Vienna, records detail scenes of nobles and wealthy merchants feasting inside communal baths. They didn't just nibble. Tables, yes, floating tables, were brought into the water, laden with roasted meats, fruits, sweet pies, cheese, and jugs of wine. The air was thick with heat, sweat, perfume, and the stench of unwashed bodies. Yet into this stew they dropped crumbs, bones, and greasy fingers, spilling gravy, wine, and oils directly into the same water others bathed in. To them it was indulgence, a symbol of wealth and power. Few things declared dominance like tearing into a goose leg with one hand while scratching your back with the other, both actions performed waist-deep in a crowded tub. Servants brought dishes to the bath's edge, sometimes even wading in to refill goblets or adjust floating trays. There was no cutlery, just fingers, and whatever was washed off those hands mixed freely with the bathwater. This dining ritual was both theatrical and intimate. Deals were made, romances blossomed, rivalries were kindled, all while flesh steamed and food floated. Contemporary accounts often describe laughter echoing off wet stone walls, the splash of wine sloshing from cups, and the thick film of grease that coated the water's surface by the meal's end. And though these bathhouses catered to the rich, the water itself was communal, meaning dozens, even hundreds, used it in a single day. Hygiene, by modern standards, was non-existent. The concept of germs hadn't been discovered. No one thought twice about soaking beside an open wound or letting wine mix with bathwater that had seen countless strangers' skin, sweat, and bodily fluids. In fact, some bathhouses weren't even drained daily. The same water might be used from morning until night, slowly transforming into a soup of soap residue, oils, food scraps, blood, and human waste. What's even more disturbing is that many bathers didn't eat before bathing. They ate while bathing because they believed the warmth aided digestion. It was common to hear medical justifications, too, that hot water opened the pores and allowed both food and toxins to pass more freely. The body, they claimed, could absorb medicinal herbs better this way. So, food was sometimes spiced with healing additives, believed to work more effectively when consumed while steaming. Imagine, then, a nobleman lounging in lukewarm water, chewing on meat, while a servant pours wine beside him, wine that spills into the bath and swirls near another man's wound. Just feet away, a woman plucks a piece of fruit from a floating dish, oblivious to the scum that clings to the surface. A child splashes, sending greasy droplets into someone else's cup. This wasn't a scene of quiet elegance. It was a spectacle of indulgence, chaos, and contamination. This culture of aquatic dining wasn't isolated to one region. From the Roman-inspired stew houses of England to the elaborately tiled bath chambers of the Ottoman Empire, variants of this behavior occurred wherever elite bathhouses flourished. In some cases, music played in the background. In others, entertainers were brought in, musicians, jesters, even sex workers, to elevate the experience further. But as indulgent as this may sound, the consequences were often dire. Illness spread rapidly through these waters. Skin infections, venereal diseases, and waterborne pathogens found perfect conditions in the warm, uncirculated pools. With food particles and bodily fluids floating in tandem, bathhouses became petri dishes for disease. And when outbreaks occurred, it wasn't uncommon for officials to close down bathhouses temporarily or permanently. Yet the custom didn't die quickly. Old habits lingered. Even as Renaissance thinkers began embracing more scientific ideas about the body, the allure of dining in the bath held on. It was too embedded in the culture, too linked to status and ritual. Only in the wake of rising epidemics and growing understanding of contagion did these habits begin to fade. Still, the legacy remains, captured in paintings, journals, and city records. They tell us of a time when pleasure and danger mingled freely. When the upper class, in pursuit of luxury, sat elbow to elbow in tepid water, passing plates and diseases with equal ease. It is a reminder that what once passed for sophistication can later be seen as grotesque, and that in the long arc of hygiene history, Even the most elite were not above bathing in their own decay. So the next time you think of the past as simpler or cleaner, remember this: people didn't just eat beside dirty water, they ate in it. Children were sometimes drowned or abused in bathhouses. Imagine a world where the soothing steam of a bathhouse masks the screams of forgotten children, where innocence drowns beneath the murky surface of history, and the warmth of water becomes a silent accomplice to unspeakable tragedy. This was not fiction. It was Europe in the Middle Ages and well into the early modern era. Bathhouses, those communal hubs of cleanliness and vice, were often dens of neglect, exploitation, and danger for the most vulnerable, children. In cities like London, Paris, and Nuremberg, public bathhouses were ubiquitous. They promised hygiene, relaxation, and even spiritual cleansing. But these steamy sanctuaries also concealed a darker reality. Poor families, desperate to earn a living or unburden themselves, sent their children, especially servant girls and boys, into these bathhouses to work. They fetched water, scrubbed wooden floors slick with grease and mildew, and carried towels across crowded rooms. Most were under 10. Few were supervised. The bathhouse was a hazardous place. Pools were deep, tiles were slippery, and fumes from boiling water mixed with human waste and rot in the air. There are records, chilling and specific, of children slipping on wet stones and falling into scalding tubs, of infants drowned in communal pools, their deaths written off as misfortune. Some were crushed underfoot in the chaos of drunken patrons, others forgotten entirely in the sweltering heat, left to suffocate in corners where no adult bothered to look. Worse still was the deliberate harm. The anonymity of the bathhouse, its mist, its nakedness, its noise, created the perfect cover for abuse. Historical accounts from legal records and personal diaries reveal that children were sometimes molested by patrons or exploited by bathhouse owners who saw them not as individuals, but as part of the building's function. A clean towel, a bucket of water, a silent servant. The lines blurred between worker, orphan, and victim. One particularly disturbing account comes from a 15th century investigation in Bruges, where several girls employed at a local bathhouse were found dead over the span of a single year. Locals claimed the deaths were accidents, drownings, sudden illness, fainting from heat, but records show injuries inconsistent with falls or fever. The bathhouse owner faced no real punishment. He claimed the girls were prone to fainting and weak constitution. No one argued. In many cases, servant children weren't even paid. Their labor was part of a wider debt system, children sent to work off family obligations or simply given over to institutions. Once inside the steam-filled walls of these establishments, they were forgotten by the outside world. If they vanished, there were few to ask why. If they died, they were quickly replaced. The church was often silent on these matters. While some clergymen condemned public bathhouses for their ties to sin and prostitution, few championed the welfare of working children. In fact, many religious institutions owned bathhouses themselves, reaping profits while ignoring the fate of the children employed within. To acknowledge their suffering would mean admitting complicity. Even the laws of the time offered little protection. Bathhouse-related deaths were rarely investigated unless nobility was involved. Common children, especially those of peasants or vagrants, were expendable. Their lives and deaths were written in margins, if at all. Yet not all accounts are devoid of resistance. In late 16th century Frankfurt, a widow named Greta Molin testified against a local bathhouse after her daughter drowned during her first week of service. Greta claimed her daughter, age 7, had been beaten for dropping a bucket, then left to clean near the deep pool alone. She never came out. Greta's testimony stirred outrage, but no justice followed. The bathhouse remained open. No charges were filed. Such tragedies were often repeated, but rarely remembered. Bathhouses were essential parts of city life. Their reputation as spaces of comfort and care eclipsed the realities of those who kept them running. Children were the invisible labor, underfed, overworked, and left to die behind closed steam-room doors. In time, as public health reforms began to take root in the 18th and 19th centuries and child labor laws slowly emerged, The horrors of the medieval bathhouse faded. Sanitation became science, not superstition. Children were no longer sent into dangerous work as a matter of course. But the scars remained, in city records, in forgotten graves, in family lines cut short by one slippery step or one cruel hand. We often romanticize the past, seeing cobblestone streets and candlelight, imagining simpler times. But within those shadows, hidden behind the veil of rising steam, was a reality far more brutal. A reality where the laughter of children was drowned out by boiling water, where no one noticed when a little hand stopped moving, and where history, too often, looked away. The next time you hear of medieval bathhouses, of their revelry, their relaxation, their role in society, remember the servant child in the corner. Remember the water she never rose from. Remember that beneath the surface of comfort there was pain, and that behind the stories we retell with fascination, there are others, quieter, bloodier, harder to face, that still wait to be heard. Would you like? Some used bathhouses for bloodletting. In the water. Imagine stepping into a bathhouse in 14th century Europe, not as a place of luxury, but a place of ritual, healing, and sometimes horror. The warm, steamy air thickens with the scent of wet wood, mildew, human sweat, and blood. Because in a practice both astonishing and revolting by modern standards, bathhouses weren't just for bathing. Some were also used for bloodletting, directly in the shared water. At the time, the theory of the four humors governed much of medieval medicine: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, it was believed, came from an imbalance of these humors. One of the primary treatments? Drain the excess, especially blood. Barbers, often doubling as amateur surgeons, were the ones to carry it out. These weren't the hairdressers we think of today. In the Middle Ages, the term barber surgeon referred to a man who might cut hair, pull teeth, lance boils, or open a vein with a sharpened blade. And where better to open a vein, they thought, than in a bath? The heat of the water would draw the blood closer to the surface. The warmth relaxed the body, making the procedure supposedly safer, the blood flow smoother. Patients would be submerged in communal tubs, sometimes alone, but often alongside others. And then the barber would cut a vein, allowing blood to spill into the water. It wasn't uncommon for several people to be bled in succession in the same bath. The water turned red, the others simply looked away. This wasn't an act of malice, but of medicine, or what was understood to be medicine at the time. These bathhouses weren't surgical theaters. They were everyday public facilities, open to the public, cheap and crowded, especially in cities like Paris, Vienna, and Prague. Men, women, and children shared these spaces. Conversations drifted through the steam. People ate meals, drank wine, shared gossip, and sometimes unknowingly shared blood-borne pathogens. And while bloodletting wasn't exclusive to bathhouses, the combination of the two practices created uniquely disturbing risks. Historians have noted cases in which disease spread rapidly through entire neighborhoods. With no knowledge of germ theory, people didn't realize that open wounds in warm, contaminated water could be deadly. If one person carried an infection like syphilis or leprosy, their blood might seep into the water, touching every crack and pore of those bathing nearby. In some places, bathhouse operators even promoted bloodletting as part of the wellness routine. Wooden signs advertised it as a cure for fevers, headaches, or melancholia. Special chairs were positioned beside tubs for those who requested it. They would be bled into bowls while their feet remained immersed, or simply allowed to bleed into the water if privacy or equipment were lacking. Bathhouse bloodletting became so common that some cities attempted to regulate it. In Frankfurt and elsewhere in the Holy Roman Empire, guilds of barber surgeons formed to standardize the practice. But corruption and lack of oversight meant rules were often ignored. The poorest citizens, desperate for relief from illness, submitted to these procedures without question. And while the upper classes may have had private rooms and better sanitation, many still engaged in communal rituals that blended luxury and risk in equal measure. And all of this unfolded beneath ceilings thick with steam, in rooms where blood trickled into drains, or not at all. The floors grew slippery. Tools were reused. Towels soaked with blood were wrung out, dried, and handed to the next visitor. In some cases, the same blade was used across multiple clients, sharpened but rarely cleaned. The symbolic red and white barber pole, still seen outside barbershops today, echoes this history. The red for blood, the white for bandages. It is a reminder that barbers once wielded razors not just to style, but to bleed. By the late 16th century, attitudes began to change. As scientific understanding slowly replaced superstition, bloodletting fell out of favor. But the damage had been done. In some plague outbreaks, bathhouses were shuttered not just because of disease fears, but because of their filthy, blood-soaked reputations. The very places once meant to cleanse the body were now seen as dens of infection. Bloodletting itself has a long lineage stretching back to ancient civilizations. The Greeks, Egyptians, and Persians all practiced it. But its integration into European bathhouse culture was uniquely medieval. During the 12th and 13th centuries, medical texts like those of Avicenna were translated into Latin, and bloodletting was repopularized across Christian Europe. The hot baths of Roman tradition merged with this Middle Eastern medical practice, forming a hybrid ritual that persisted for centuries. Even monarchs and clergy participated. King Charles V of France was said to have bled regularly in hot baths under the care of his royal barbers. The Pope's own medical attendants were trained in the art. This lent the practice legitimacy, embedding it deeply into the culture of health. If the nobility did it, so too would the commoners. It became fashionable, even spiritual, an act of purging not just the body, but the soul. But the truth lay beneath the surface. As bodies bled into shared tubs, hepatitis, syphilis, and even plague pathogens circulated freely. There were no antiseptics, no understanding of microbial life. And for the young, elderly, or already sick, the combination of blood loss and potential infection could be fatal. These bathhouses, often viewed as social hubs, held hidden dangers no one understood. Archaeological digs in parts of Eastern Europe have uncovered remnants of bathhouse floors stained with iron deposits, evidence of repeated bloodletting. Written accounts from traveling physicians describe waters tinged red, yet praising the practice as invigorating. Some chroniclers even wrote that bleeding in warm water allowed the evil humors to escape more willingly, as if the body itself opened to divine healing. This fusion of medicine, belief, and ignorance formed a cultural norm that persisted for centuries. And while today we recoil at the thought, it's important to remember, they were doing what they thought was right, what was common, what was trusted. They didn't see the blood as pollution, but as purification. It wasn't until the Enlightenment that scientific rigor began dismantling these practices. The microscope, germ theory, antiseptics. All these developments came too late for the millions who passed through the stained waters of Europe's bathhouses. Their blood washed away, their names forgotten, but their suffering remains etched into the foundations of medical history. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: in chasing health, they shared disease. In seeking comfort, they found risk. And in trusting their healers, they sometimes stepped willingly into water that could kill. The fall of bathhouses marked the rise of body odor culture. When bathhouses began to vanish from the urban centers of Europe, the collapse wasn't just about buildings falling into disrepair. It marked a deeper, stranger transformation in how entire civilizations perceived their own bodies. In the space once filled by steam, sweat, and soap came something far more pungent: body odor as identity. But this shift wasn't accidental. It was the product of fear, superstition, and centuries of cultural conditioning that rewrote the human relationship with hygiene. The decline of bathhouses accelerated during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, not because people suddenly preferred filth, but because they were terrified. Epidemics like the Black Death ravaged communities with such ferocity that every aspect of life became suspect. Bathhouses, once centers of relaxation and ritual cleansing, became scapegoats for disease. Medical knowledge was primitive. Germ theory had not yet been born. Instead, theories of miasma, bad air, and imbalanced humors prevailed. It was believed that bathing, by opening the pores, allowed dangerous vapors and corruption from the outside world to enter the body. Water, once viewed as purifying, was rebranded as a threat. Doctors and religious authorities began to warn against hot baths. Excessive washing, they claimed, weakened the body's natural defenses. The skin was no longer a barrier, it was a portal, and water made it vulnerable. People feared that soaking themselves in a tub might invite in pestilence. The Church did little to defend cleanliness. In fact, some clergy condemned bathing altogether, especially mixed-gender bathing, framing it as a gateway to sin. Moral decay, they insisted, was far more dangerous than dirty skin. And thus, a cultural turning point was reached. To be unwashed was no longer shameful, it was virtuous. This fear-driven shift gave rise to what historians now refer to as the dry hygiene era. Across much of Europe, water was shunned. Instead of soap and scrubbing, people turned to dry cloths, powders, and most famously, perfumes. Scent became armor. Aristocrats doused themselves in lavender, musk, and rosewater, not just to smell pleasant, but to mask the stench of rot and sweat their bodies naturally produced. This wasn't seen as laziness, it was considered intelligent. Perfume became a symbol of wealth, health, and social status. If you could afford to smell like flowers, you didn't need to bathe. In fact, some believed that bathing could cause disease outright. One 16th-century French physician even warned that frequent washing is the cause of fevers, catarrhs, and various pestilences. Instead of tubs, noble households carried perfumed handkerchiefs to press to their noses when the stench of crowded streets overwhelmed them. Clothing was layered thickly to absorb bodily oils, and garments were brushed rather than laundered. Linen shirts were worn not to stay clean, but to soak up sweat so it wouldn't stain outer garments. A person's scent was their essence, natural or not. But perhaps the most intense irony lies in how the poor, who couldn't afford perfumes or changes of linen, became defined by their odor. The working classes had no choice but to carry their body's scent as a badge, one that increasingly came to represent poverty and low breeding. The rich, meanwhile, floated through cities in clouds of ambergris and civet musk, their rankness hidden under imported fragrance. And so body odor became politicized, racialized, and moralized. To be clean-smelling was to be powerful. To stink was to be suspect. Interestingly, some people missed the bathhouse era, not for hygiene, but for social reasons. Public baths had been places of conversation, courtship, business dealings, and community gossip. When they closed, many of those spaces were lost. In some regions, like parts of Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, bathhouses endured much longer. In fact, the Turkish hammam continued to flourish while Western Europe recoiled in paranoia. This contrast would later lead Enlightenment thinkers to reevaluate their own relationship with the body. Was Europe falling behind, not just scientifically, but in terms of basic human comfort? By the 18th century, whispers of reform emerged. Philosophers, physicians, and explorers began to write about cleanliness as a virtue, once again, not just morally, but medically. Yet the old fears lingered. Even when soap became more affordable and water pipes more common, many people resisted daily bathing. Queen Elizabeth I was said to bathe only once a month. Louis XIV of France reportedly bathed twice in his entire life. Perfume still reigned supreme. The idea of immersing the body in water remained distasteful to many until the late 19th century. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and the scientific validation of germ theory that hygiene slowly began to reclaim its place in Western life. Hospitals began sterilizing instruments. Cities built sewage systems. Soap was mass-produced and advertised as a household essential. Yet even then, habits changed slowly. The idea that a little dirt never hurt persisted deep into the 20th century, with many still believing that overwashing was a mark of vanity or weakness. Body odor had become so normalized that entire deodorant industries had to be invented to reverse it. And so the fall of bathhouses did not just usher in an age of physical grime, it cultivated an entire culture around odor. It shaped fashion, behavior, medicine, and social class for generations. What began as fear of disease became a new kind of aesthetic. People lived in layers of musk and sweat, believing they were protecting themselves from invisible evils. In truth, they were simply burying the past under powder and perfume. The echoes of that era remain today. The ritual of bathing, daily showers, scented soaps, and hygienic routines might feel natural to us now, but it is the result of a long, turbulent history. One shaped not by logic or comfort, but by centuries of anxiety, misinformation, and moral posturing. The next time you turn on the tap, remember, you are defying generations who believed water was dangerous, who masked their fear with flowers, and who thought cleanliness could damn the soul. You are in many ways reclaiming what was lost in the steam of a vanished bathhouse. Let that be a reminder. How we treat our bodies is not only a matter of health, it's a story of culture, fear, and the strange evolution of belief.